As I mentioned, there you go. So the recording is now in progress. Jenna will also be taking some high-level sort of summary notes of the meeting. And as I mentioned, the time will be somewhat flexible about timelines here. So we've reserved until noon, but if we don't need till noon, we'll end early, but we will reserve time at the end of the meeting for public comment. Hallie, I noticed that you as a member of the public joined a little bit after others. Were you hoping to give public comment? And if so, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand with your reaction button, that would be helpful to get you in the queue, and we'll make sure to plan accordingly. I guess, by way of introducing today's meeting, we have a fair amount to cover in terms of feedback on the table of contents and OSU talking about their plan and approach for the FMP process. There was some dialogue over email that I think will be addressed in terms of staffing, resources, expertise in that discussion. I know that many of us had hoped we'd be sort of further along in the FMP process at this point in time, and are anxious to get really ahead of steam behind this work. And I think today is important in terms of setting the stage to do that. It's all of you are up to a difficult and important endeavor with this FMP development. It's going to involve a lot of the details of information and content that folks are really interested in. It's important, obviously, for OSU as a research institution to have an FMP that works for them. And it's unique, I think, in terms of developing a research forest FMP, because it's also involving all of you. It's not just a research institution on its own, but also developing this FMP in coordination and collaboration and partnership with a diverse set of stakeholders. And I guess my hope for today would be that we, through the conversation, through the feedback folks have provided, and through additional opportunities as we continue the work going forward, that we begin to create through the table of contents and the architecture and framework for the FMP, the outline and the framework for a document that does in fact create an FMP that is functional, workable, and meaningful for OSU as a research institution, and something that is likewise functional, meaningful, and captures the interests of the parties that are at the table here, supporting OSU and your own interests in this important endeavor with the Elliott. So, I think we have a lot of opportunity here to integrate your feedback, talk about the feedback that came. I think we saw specific input from Steve Andringa, from Mark Stern, and from Bob Salinger. I know others probably have additional suggestions and that will come out today. As always, you have today during our meeting to provide input, as well as opportunities through email or picking up the phone and calling Katie or Tom and others on the OSU team to give your suggestions. So with that said, any questions, comments about the agenda or the purpose of today's meeting? All right. So we'll get straight to it. So really I'm going to turn it over to the OSU team here to talk about the draft table of contents, the timeline for committee input, and then if we have time, and included in that, I think is a back and forth a little bit on the feedback that was given by working group members. And then we'll hopefully have a little bit of time to talk about data and information that folks have suggested that OSU be looking at and considering in FMP development. And then we'd like to make sure to, before we conclude, talk about both next steps for the FMP process, as well as preparations for the July 19 full advisory committee meeting. And what, if anything, you all would like to say, as well as a bit of time for OSU to talk about how it might present and talk about the FMP content process. So with that, Katie, Tom, and OSU team, I turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Peter. And I'm just going to basically turn it over to Katie and Anna to walk through the FMP table of contents as a starting point, and we can go from there. I just would start out by saying that this process that we're embarking on now of writing the forest management plan is this logical and next outcome from the research forest proposal that was approved ultimately approved following the December 8th board meeting. And these two documents will be inextricably linked. They are independent documents, but the one builds upon the other. And we first of all need to keep in mind that process that led to the research proposal completion was a collaborative process involving all your input and a long, hard road to get there. And as was said over and over, not everybody got everything they wanted in the process, but it was a collaborative process, and it was successful in that regard. This next step of building the forest management plan has to build off of that conceptual research forest plan and provide the framework for moving forward. So there's a similar process that has to be undertaken now with all of your input, and we're listening and we're modifying as we go. Again, making this as open and collaborative as possible. But it's, this is uncharted territory in terms of taking a state forest and converting it into a research forest at this sort of magnitude. And so we all have a learning process to go through here as we work through it. I just want to emphasize that in addition to this advisory committee, we are also seeking input and advice from other groups as well. We have an internal committee that's made up of other deans and the research vice president here on campus that provide me input on from a university level feedback. We have an executive team also here on campus that is providing input and support for risk management and financial management. And then finally, we have this group of research forest directors that we have engaged with that are providing input independently, as well as willingness to serve as a team for support for this process. So as we move forward, keeping in mind that we have these different resources to draw on, and as we build out this plan, we're not doing this in a vacuum. It's not College of Forestry trying to push ahead with a plan that is done without input from experts. We are working with individuals that have been deeply involved, directly involved in writing research forest management plans in the past. So, we really appreciate all the hard work and input that's coming from the advisory committee. And we are looking forward to working with you all moving this process forward. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Katie to and Anna to take on the, yeah, go ahead, Peter, you wanted to.
Yeah, I just had a hand raised. Bob Salinger wanted to say something really quickly or ask you a question.
Sure.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I'm also monitoring a Marble Morelet hearing at ODF&W today that I'm speaking at, so I'm doing double duty trying to watch two meetings simultaneously. So I may be dropping on and off a good deal. Tom, I appreciate the panels you put together, but the one thing I'm still not seeing is species scientists for the HCP species. And that to me remains a tremendous deficit, that, we're going into an HCP process and an FMP process without teams lined up to deal with the three species that, are of primary concern on the Elliott.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that's going to be remedied or not, because I think it's playing out in a variety of different ways in terms of that not having that expertise on board.
Well, I guess I'm going to let Katie address who is on board currently, and that we have reached out to individuals asking for their input all throughout the process, and we will continue to do that. One of the challenges for us is, Bob, is until, researchers will engage in a process that they see an opportunity to conduct research as a part of that. And they're reluctant to engage fully if there is no research support moving forward, if there's not certainty about opportunities for graduate students or opportunities for this to actually evolve into a full-fledged research program that they can engage in. And so we have struggled a little bit getting certain individuals to commit and say, yes, I'll, fully engage.
I hear that there's a lot of uncertainty. So,
yeah, no, I understand that, Tom, but I also would say that there are plenty of systems short of having, a permanent standing advisory committee.
Right.
And I don't think we've availed ourselves of those things either. I don't think, for example, and I think it's really playing out in the HCP, that we sent out the plan to spotted owl biologists for review. We didn't send out the marble murrelet aspects to the Pacific seabird group, for example, and other groups that would absolutely peer review those things, give you feedback. We've just been skipping that step over and over again. And I think it's really playing out now in ways that are problematic. So, I just want to keep flagging that because right now we're not in a position where, we're very, very concerned about what's emerging in that HCP. And I think that is a reflection of the lack of kind of rigorous analysis that I would expect in any one of these processes, but particularly of a research institution like OSU.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that, Bob, and I appreciate you bringing it up and flagging it. It is something that we want the best outcome possible. We in terms of the HCP and review process, that's handled by DSL. That's not we are not running that process, and so I would ask Jeff to comment on engagement on that front. But Katie, if you want to discuss, efforts to bring people into the circle on the research front for the university, please do so as well.
Jeff, do you want to start to speak to the HCP thing? And actually, Jeff, if I could very briefly, I've got two quick housekeeping items. One, we've got a 970 number that's joined, and if possible, we'd like to get a name associated with that. 970 ending with 572. If you could let us know who you are. Or you can potentially,
This is 970. My name is Ann Wickman.
Okay. Thanks, Ann.
Thank you.
And I just so for folks' awareness, Paul Beck is in a remote location and struggling to connect. We're in text communication, and I'll keep you posted. Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I guess my response is I don't want to hijack the FMP conversation with an elongated discussion around the HCP process, and happy to talk with Bob more about it. Katie and I both have been working with anybody that wants to talk to us about what the working draft of the HCP is. And I think OSU has brought in folks with murrelet expertise off and on through the process. Maybe it's been more behind the scenes than the front of house, but at DSL anyway, we've been comfortable that OSU's had the engagement of Murrelet scientists that have been part of the process and developing some of the responses to draft comments. DSL is running the process, but we're doing it in partnership with OSU, and every step of the way, there's been an opportunity for anybody that OSU wants to bring in to comment on stuff and prepare drafts, and the same with DSL. No, we have not put together a formal peer review of scientific panels with Murrelet and OWL expertise that have done a formal part of the process in developing the draft. But that hasn't been precluded, and the process is really, Bob, I think we've talked about this before. It's a long way from being done. Right now, we had the first cut at a working draft that we put out for public comment that ended a couple of weeks ago. We got about 400 comments, and we're synthesizing those and coming back, I think this week, or not this week, next week, with a turnaround of revisions being made to the HCP. So I think that's the status of the HCP. We'll talk a lot more about it at the July 19th advisory committee meeting as well. But there will be a new draft out that reflects a lot of the input that we've gotten. And I'm not sure that we really lacked expertise in OWLs and Murrelets in terms of input into what's going on in the HCP at this point. I'm unconvinced that that's been totally lacking.
I'm not convinced it's been totally lacking, Jeff, but I will say that it's an issue that's been raised since the get-go. Yes. This does not meet the standards that I see. And for example, the Western Oregon Forest HCP doesn't meet the standards that we've seen in other processes like this. And we've been raising it for a long time, and it keeps getting sort of kicked down the road and kind of kicked around. But I just want to flag that from our perspective, the absence of independent spotted owl and marble murrelet specific review, and OSU did go out and get a whole bunch of folks that are associated with research forests to do a review. They did not go out and do that same level of rigor with those species. And I think it's a huge deficit that's now playing out. It's going to play out in the FMP. It's going to play out in the HCP. And from our perspective, it is critical to go forward and to resolve this issue. And I feel like we've had the same conversation around this a dozen times. And I'm just flagging for you all that for Audubon, it is not getting to a point of resolution. It's getting to a point where we're increasingly feeling that this is simply the way it's going to be. There's some sort of block here that's keeping this process from being like other processes in terms of the rigor and review. And that is undermining our confidence at this point in a serious way.
Well, we should talk about it in the context of the HCP. I'm not aware of other HCP processes that the state has run that have had a formal scientific panel peer review prior to submission to the federal agencies. There's obviously a lot of opportunity to pull in experts that can help frame the submission that's going to be made to the federal agencies to see if there's sufficiency in the terms. And that's what we're trying to do. And that is, I guess we can keep talking about it, but probably in a different meeting or at a different time.
I just wanted to chime in a bit too. Bob, I agree with you in a lot of respects. And I think that the expertise for the marble murrelet is one that we have sought and we have gotten as part of our research proposal. That we work very hard to engage experts in that and to go into a lot of detail. And I think came up with a very good proposal on how to move forward for marble murrelets. I agree, we haven't done that fully for spotted owls, but it's something, again, as part of the forest management process. As soon as we have the resources to engage those people, I think we have a lot of them to engage, and I think they'll be fully on board. So I encourage you to keep, bringing that up, and we'll continue to to keep doing it as part of this process. This is like a kind of a kickoff meeting and initiation of the forest management plan. And I think that this is a way for us as we start to set that table to make sure we put the right pieces on it. And so I agree with you totally. So, and as a research forest, that's where we would go anyways. We want to make sure we're doing research that's current and relevant to these experts. And so that's all part of the discussion.
And so, I guess what I'm looking for as part of the FMP process is for that to be incorporated in a somewhat formal way. And I'd love to have a discussion. I don't want to take any more time today about who we think it would be advisable to send out this plan to and get feedback on it, especially as it pertains to the eastern portions of the forest where you're going to be doing harvest and in among marble murrelet trimas and in suitable habitat, as to what the actual impacts will be, what the benefits will be over time in terms of habitat coming online. I think there's a real formal need for input at this point. And so I just want to keep pushing you toward that as much as I can.
Yeah, no, and it's more than review we want substantive input into terms of what would the design of a research question that is really important for marbled murrelets and or for spotted owls, what would they look like, and how would it be incorporated into the management plan? So that's part of the reason why we have this whole section on identifying key research ideas, and then how do they get incorporated into the management plan? Because much different than a forest management plan that, where somebody, their outcome or their output is funding, resources, or funding the schools, or funding the counties, or however many of the research plans for state forests are run. Our output is research. That is our currency. It's not the money that we're trying to put out. We're trying to put out relevant research that helps inform policy and decision making across all these issues. So that's where we see it's really important to involve the people who are interested in receiving that research in terms of the policy side, as well as the people that would be conceiving of it and carrying it out. So we see that full spectrum as being critical.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Bob, for raising it. And I guess I'd like to turn it into a bit of an action item. If folks have, we entered this particular expertise topic through the lens of spotted owl and murrelets. There may be other areas of expertise that folks are interested in. I'm thinking of riparian, sort of operational stuff that folks like Paul and others have raised. If you have suggestions of individuals that could be helpful for both input and or review, maybe that you could send them directly to Katie for their consideration as we go forward with this process. And then Katie, I'm going to turn it over to you. But with that, I also just via text, Paul wanted me to emphasize something that he's mentioned previously about the importance of having a different type of expertise sort of in the forest management plan development expertise, sort of professional help, as opposed to relying just on internal folks and or the advisory committee, and the importance of bringing some individual, somebody on board to help with FMP development. So another area of expertise that he wanted to emphasize during today's meeting, even though he's not able to join right now. So maybe something you're able to address in your conversation today, Katie and Tom. With that, Katie, I'd leave it to you.
Okay. I appreciate that. And I just kind of wanted to see if there was any other questions before we get started, or kind of head off into the land of PowerPoint and discussion. So we have a lot of detailed materials we've sent out, and we've gotten some really good feedback. So I just wanted to check in.
Yeah, Mark, it looks like Mark's got a comment or question.
Yeah, I guess I guess I just wanted to share as and I shared some of this in an email yesterday, but just from my own perspective, as I began to review and sort of take in and think about some of the materials there and try and, come up with my own thoughts on how to respond to them a little bit. I think I was also struck with that, at least for myself, I didn't know that I had the deep expertise to evaluate forest management plans and the components of it. And so I felt a little unable to get the feeling from myself that I was giving the input that maybe you needed. And it's sort of not to overly reflect my own feeling on others, but just looking at the advisory committee with, that we have participating, Keith, Bob, Paul, and Ken. I'm not sure collectively, this is really the group that's deeply steeped in sort of developing forest management plans. So I guess my caution is just that I think the advisory committee here is sort of a soft review of what's going on. And I don't want it to be mischaracterized of at some point down the road, well, the advisory committee signed off on it. And I think we just need to recognize the level of expertise that collectively, and I don't mean to diminish the value of my colleagues here on the advisory committee, but I think collectively, I'm not sure we're the strongest group of 5 or 6 people to providing in-depth review of the forest management plan. So I just share that back to you. I don't know if the advisory committee can be augmented in any way, but that was just sort of my feeling. Was I wasn't sure. I was left with an inadequacy in terms of what I was able to share back to the group, to you all, in terms of being as deep as maybe it needed to be. So
Mark, I think it's a helpful point, and one that, and Tom, it looks like you had a response to that as well. Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, I was just going to acknowledge, Mark, that I completely agree. And I think that, having additional expertise in this group that's helping guide that end of things would be really helpful. Steve and Dringa provided that. And so, bringing that back in with Steve's departure would be great. And then in terms of, once again, emphasizing that we are working with this group of research forest directors to help guide our management plan development will be helpful on that front. And it may be that the advisory committee wants one or more of those individuals to participate in one of these open meetings that might be really fruitful in with moving forward.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Mark, for raising it. And I think it's important that, thinking of this group not as an important sounding board, but not the group responsible for FMP development in and of itself, and the expertise that Bob, you're raising, Mark, you're raising, Paul, and others have raised, that will be needed to sort of develop the skin and the bones of the FMP, and the real substantive content is critical, and you all will also serve an important role in terms of ensuring that your respective constituencies, that your interests are met, that the sync up with the work that you did over the last 2 years in terms of research platform and proposal development aligns with the FMP and the conversations you've had previously, et cetera. So I think duly noted in terms of sort of the substantive and FMP experience, expertise. And I think that there still is an important role for advisory committee members in terms of being an important sounding board and ensuring that your interests are reflected in the FMP. With that, Katie, you want to turn us to the table of contents, or any other comments, questions generally from the group before we get started into the details here?
Okay. Well, I'll get started too. And just, I want to also tell Mark and the other advisory committee members that what you bring is not necessarily the expertise that is in your own heart and mind, but it's also the expertise that's in the people that are part of your community of stakeholders. And so it's not just what, what one individual thinks personally, it's also what the community of stakeholders you represent think is really important. And so that's also another piece of it, I think, that we can't forget. And I know that, I just want to tell you from my own personal experience in developing the research plan, and I would often bring things to you. It's like, okay, here's where we are with this, here's this, piece. And it always seemed to be I was delivering information to you rather than gaining input earlier on in the process. And so that's part of this is right now is we're trying to make sure that we're hearing from the advisory committee throughout the process as we're developing pieces rather than just delivery. So that's also the part that I think maybe kind of puts you in maybe a little bit more uncomfortable position. But obviously, the whole goal of this, much like we did with the research planning, is to involve the people that have that expertise in that process and that part of it, but also trying to make sure that we're not walking around with blinders on, so we're not hearing what is important to you until after the decision has after the train has left the station. We're trying to get a little bit better idea of what some of the destinations might be before we leave, and that's underway. So I hope you can appreciate that as well. All right, so I have so today I'm not going to share, kind of like here's the table of contents and things like that. You guys have gotten some summary of what our feedbacks are, but there were some places where your feedback was really kind of did open our eyes a bit and made us stop and think and say, oh, wow, I agree, we're not doing that very well, or we haven't flushed that out as well. And so as part of doing that process, we kind of went back to look at some other forest management plans and say, oh, where did they put some of these key variables? So today I'm going to run through a couple of those with you and maybe get some more input. That's kind of one of our roles here today, is to hear a little bit more about from you. And so I guess so I think I've figured out share screen on here. Yeah. I think I got it. Okay, so and go here. All right, good. So everybody got there. So again, the Elliott State Research Forest Management Plan is a forest management plan for a research forest. And so those aren't written very often, and there aren't a lot of examples out there, but it's also still a forest, and it still has some basic pieces of infrastructure and parts of it that also overlap really well with other forest management plans. While we have a very different objective in terms of road systems, or in terms of, well, we have very different objectives overall in terms of research versus more financial revenue production, but we still have to maintain roads, and we still have to have a research plan or a plan or objective going forward. So in that way, there are some overlaps. And so we're kind of saying, okay, what can we learn from other forest management plans that have been written around the region? And how is that helping us inform some of the key issues that, or helping us understand some of the key issues that got brought up by the subcommittee in terms of where our table of contents was to date. So I'm going to go through some of those, but before I do that, I'm going to start a little bit with a little bit of background, because I know we have some people maybe that aren't as familiar with the context of this meeting. So, so first of all, I just want to give the context of where we're at, where this forest management plan or tactical stage fits in overall within a larger context of planning for the Elliott. So the first context is there are several federal and state laws that have to be adhered to. And those relevant laws apply at all stages, right? We can't ignore the existing Endangered Species Act, for example, because we're a research forest. We can't ignore the Oregon Forest Practices Rules because we're a research forest. We can't ignore legislative mandates and agreements with sovereign tribal nations because we're a research forest. We have to do all those things within the existing federal and state laws. And so we're not trying to create something. So that's a key part of the context. The second part is this strategic stage. There's this vision for a research forest, and those that we put forth a vision by the land board in terms of what the research forest should look like, put forth a vision that the college developed with help of many of the people in this room and outside the college, of what the research proposal, vision, and planning is. And that strategic stage also includes the habitat conservation plan, which is underway. So all these things will help define what is the sideboards of just about everything that's done on the forest. And so, but again, with that objective that it's a research forest. And so the management plan should reflect that it's a research forest. And it shouldn't reflect that it's a forest to be just in as a preservation or preserve, or it shouldn't reflect a forest that's out there trying to maximize financial return. It should reflect that it's really being designed and implemented to address these visions of the land board and the vision that's outlined in the proposal. So we're not starting from scratch. We have a ton of material and sideboards that will exist as this goes forward. So then how do we implement these strategic policies? This is kind of some of the hows. What are the things that we need to do to implement this vision? And that's where we're talking about in this forest management plan, or some of those hows. And then there's an operational stage, which maybe will get much more specific. What species are we going to plant in stand number 2368? That's going to be the operational stage. So those kinds of questions hopefully would be informed by this forest management planning stage. So the stage, this planning process, let's see if I can get this to work. This planning process starts with we start down this path, but we also learn as we go along. So it's not necessarily a strictly linear stage. It's something that is going to be adapting a little bit. And as we can see, some of that adaptation is already underway. So really, we're out there with this, looking at this. The key word that keeps coming up a lot as we look at this thing is the word of integration. And that integration isn't easy. Integration is important, though. And so taking any one objective from a researcher, from public input, or from even a legislative body, we can't take that just in as a singular entity. It's all part of the integration across the multiple stakeholder and the stakeholder communities that are part of this plan. So that's another really key thing to keep in mind, because the tendency is to go into some things and ignore others because that's a little bit easier, but that integration is important. And I really think in the research proposal, we achieved that integration. And I think that's something that we all should be really proud of and not forget about it as we dive into the management planning process. So as part of that, again, one of the first things that we need to do really well to do any kind of a plan is to collect the information and the data that's available, put it into a data management plan so it's shareable across the team and across the group. So we're all working from the same data, and we have a data set that's up to date and inclusive of data streams that maybe aren't always always the ones you might think of, but they're the data management, the data and the information that's really important to help us make decisions as we go forward. And then to put that into a structure that's available and transparent so people can see what data we're using and why. And that comes up a lot in issues because almost all decisions start with data. And they don't always end up there, but that's usually where they start. So that data management plan is a key part of this process. Whoops. Then the next one is how do you use that data to help inform your decisions and going forward. And we do that a lot through models and simulations. Some of them are mental models and mental simulations, and some of them are more computer objective ones. Some of them are very short term and small spatial scale, and some of them are really long term. So if we want to say what's the likelihood of, a certain stand treatment or a certain experiment leading to meet the definition of marble murrelet habitat, we would put that into a model that would help us look at the diameter distribution in the future or the potential outcomes of those practices, as well as what are the sideboards on that in terms of how much variation is there in our model output. So if we get an answer with one way and a different answer with another way and a different answer with another way, we need to average those and say, here's our best estimation of that answer, and here's the amount of variation we expect around that answer. So also getting and understanding that when you come up with a decision or a space, how much variability is around that. And then also to use those outputs to help us design experiments. There's probably nothing more interesting than to try to simulate something or a process and then realize the parts of the process that you cannot simulate well because you don't have enough information. It immediately puts a spotlight on where you should be designing an experiment. And we come across that in the habitat conservation planning process. We came across that a lot in the research planning process. And so it's really a critical piece. And I don't think it's one that we often think about, but being able to say, if we can better understand the effect of ocean conditions on marble murrelet nesting, we can then better design a way to survey them and to understand when is the best time to survey them. But it's not until we develop that understanding of their behavior that we can expect to have a survey protocol that will be best able to detect their presence or absence. So that's just one example of the kinds of things that you learn by running a model and looking at simulations and then looking back to design that experiment. And that's the process we're underway that we really want to undertake as we go forward. Oops, keep going backwards. Sorry about that. And then all that information, the kind of experiments we should have, the kind of integrative understanding of these processes that we're really striving for really requires a landscape analysis. And some of you are very aware of this because I've gotten some excellent input that says we need to do this we need to look at these sub watersheds, and make sure that we're allocating these treatments correctly and that we're doing it within to optimize what this objective of integrations are. And where we can improve that landscape analysis will help us understand that. The same thing goes, we've already done some landscape level analysis, for example, looking at wood delivery to fish-bearing streams. So we look at the whole landscape, we look at the potential or the probability of wood that falls into that stream of making it down into a fish-bearing stream so that we can then add additional guidelines to make sure that wood is available when that system fails to deliver, so that wood is delivered to the fish-bearing streams. That's the kind of analysis that you can do when you start to look at the landscape, not the individual reaches. So that becomes really critical. And that part, again, is part of our analysis. And so that we can start to identify what are the give and takes, the pluses and minuses, the integration, what is the balance that's going to occur as we move forward with any one of our treatments. And that occurs at the subwatershed level. It occurs at the forest level, the entire, or I should say at the management research watershed level. It occurs at the combination of the conservation research and the management research level. And then it also occurs as you put the whole thing into the context of the landscape surrounding it. So you have oceans to the west, that has a huge impact on that forest. You have a wilderness area to the north. You actually have a very highly or intensively managed private industrial forest to the south. And you have a lot of federal lands that are managed in quite an interesting matrix, primarily to the east. So how does that fit within the context and thinking about the Elliott? Because ironically, what's interesting about it, the Elliott, we have this, what we call a triad design. But if you also look around the Elliott, that triad design is magnified, whether you go north, south, east, or west in very different ways. And so we actually have a triad inside of a triad, if you look at the Coast Range as a whole. So all those pieces are part of the landscape analysis, but they're there at the 6,000 or the 10,000 foot level. But if you do your analysis correctly, you can zone right down into the individual stand level and understand those larger scale, both time and space, that a decision made today places in a larger context. So that kind of goes off into the monitoring plan. That if I used to have a very wise professor who I just had a meal with the other day, but he also always said, if you don't know where you're going, you won't know when you get there. And so that monitoring plan is really there to help us determine where we're going and how we know when we get there. And so that will, hopefully as that develops, it will identify what are the key markers, the key variables, the key pieces that all will fit that we want to monitor for. So if we have a goal out there to maintain certain levels of habitat or to maintain a certain type of timber production into the community, we would have those as part of our monitoring plan. So we could go back and see, are we meeting those goals and objectives? Are we meeting the goals and objectives that will allow us to conduct the research that we need to conduct? I mean, it's very interesting to watch a thing like the extensive treatments as we enter the HCP process. When you talk to people about the extensive treatments and they say, well, how do we know what they're going to look like in 50 years? And it's like, we can do some modeling and give you some idea of that. But if somebody had started doing this 50 years ago, we might have better output than we would have today. But the fact that we don't have it is not a reason for us not to include it in a research forest, because we want to know what are the financial outputs, what are the ecological outputs, what are the conservation outputs, what are other recreational outputs, what are the educational outputs of undergoing a new type or a transformative type of forestry. And so all those things become important to us. And if you do this correctly, and if you do this within kind of the vision we have, you don't stop and then write your forest management plan. You essentially take all these components and you assemble it. And so that's part of it. And again, this gets at, you notice the word input kind of up and down the stair steps that I've put here, but that when you assemble your FMP, you can ask yourself, is it integrated? Does it talk about the why and how of all these goals and measurable, and does it include measurable objectives? So you kind of know where you're trying to go, and hopefully when you start that assembly, you can recognize whether you got there or not. So that's the larger context. And I didn't want to forget that before we kind of dive into the weeds and look at some of these inputs. So
Katie, before we go to the weeds, at least Bob had a comment or a question, and then maybe others. Bob, why don't you start? Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. I appreciate that. You know, I guess you made a comment that, if you don't know where you're going, you can't really tell when you get there or if you get there. And I think part of the challenge I'm facing with marble murrelets in particular, but also spotted owls, is it's not clear what the destination is. I understand that you want to do research to understand impacts on particularly marble murrelets, but the reality is we have a critically endangered species. In fact, there's a hearing going on simultaneous to this one at ODF&W as to whether the marble murrelet should be uplisted from threatened to endangered. The Elliott is one of the last real strongholds for the marble murrelet in the state of Oregon. And, I think it's an interesting proposal to kind of experiment on them there, as opposed to making sure that we are really protecting them as much as possible. And so I guess one of my fears is particularly on the east side of the forest, is that we're doing lots of research, we're doing lots of treatments, but I don't see a goal at the end of the day of, actually improving the conditions for those birds in those trimas and elsewhere. What I see is a drive to do research and see what happens. Some of it, which is expected to be detrimental to the species, but I don't see sort of at the end of the day a vision for what we're really trying to achieve here, in both the research areas and the protected areas. Is really something that is better both in the short term and the long term for the species. And we don't have the luxury necessarily of waiting for the long term either. This is a species that's on the brink now. So what we do to its habitat is critically important. And I guess I'm just not still seeing the sideboards that tell me that we are going to be able to really evaluate whether we're getting to where we need to go and the conditions are truly better for them.
Well, I guess.
Oh,
Oh, go ahead, Tom.
well, I really appreciate Bob's comment, and I wanted to, I guess I've said this before, so maybe I don't want to sound repetitive, but the hope is, Bob, that the long term is, as Katie just mentioned a moment ago, is transformational change in terms of forestry in the coastal and in the Pacific Northwest in general. And with the research conducted at the Elliott providing a pathway forward, perhaps initially for state and federal land management and for, small private landowners, but then moving the needle for larger private landowners as well. And if the research forest that's 80,000, 82,000 acres can shed that light for management across millions of acres, then in the long run, we're looking at not only protecting a species, but from peril, but advancing their populations back to numbers that ultimately lead to their delisting. I mean, the intent of the research is to find that those approaches to forest management that cause minimal impact to the system and specifically to those species that are imperiled right now. But more broadly to a much broader array of species and to, human systems as well. And so I totally get it, because it is really, there's a, unusually great habitat throughout the Elliott, but at the same time, the Elliott is roughly 50% heavily managed in the past and provides an environment where research can be conducted. And we tried to identify that through the the limited data that we have and the data that is somewhat out of date, and thus the need to collect and analyze current data to actually lay out a plan for how to proceed. But we did the best we could with the data that we had to lay out a plan where there was minimal impact to TNE species, and yet allowed us to conduct research that would help us understand if the management could improve the conditions for the species as a whole across this forest. And obviously with the large block reserves and the distributed reserves, the hope is that is, adequate for maintaining populations, but that we at the same time are conducting research and improving the condition of habitat across a portion of the forest that ultimately leads to improved conditions compared to what they were when this whole process started in 2013 or 2014.
Tom, and I get all that, but I guess I just want to reiterate two things. One is that when you talk to marble murrelet experts, what they tell you is if we're going to recover this species, it's going to be by protecting the maximum amount of occupied and suitable habitat that's out there on the landscape. But this is an urgent situation, and those things are the linchpins to protecting this species. And and the Elliott again represents one of the most important areas for this species. Number two, I get the long-term sort of how do we transform the landscape, and I think that's an important question for us. But we also need to recognize that some of this habitat is not going to be suitable. Especially the clear cuts that are being transformed won't be suitable during the lifetime of this HCP. It may not be suitable for 100, 150 years, and so. Again, we don't have the luxury of waiting on habitat that may come into existence decades from now to replace habitat that we may degrade in the shorter term. And so again, that's why I keep coming back to the need to really understand how the trimas and suitable habitat are going to be addressed at a watershed level. So we really can see that overall in the short term, we're actually improving conditions, not chipping away at what little is left. I mean, I think that's the concern is when you get down to that watershed level, all those east side trimas potentially, depending on how we do this, could all become degraded relative to what they are today. And that's
I mean, that would be a travesty. I mean, the intent is absolutely to not degrade habitat. The intent is to improve the condition of the habitat across the forest as a whole. The existing plantation forests that remain in that condition being obviously the exception to that, but the intent to conduct research on a portion of the forest where and with the reserves functioning as a significant portion of that research opportunity. But at the same time, Bob, and I totally get your point, and our intent is to minimize any degradation of habitat of TNE species, and that is why the collection of current data is so important in laying out this forest management plan. So I guess I'll just terminate my comments by just saying thank you, Bob, and we recognize that is absolutely not the objective here. We do not want to degrade habitat. Quite the opposite. We want to conduct research that sheds a light on how management can be conducted in a way that affords both high quality habitat as well as meeting other objectives, including timber objectives. So
Sure. I'll let it go here, Tom, but I would just say that right now in the HCP, there are 4,000 acres of occupied and suitable habitat that could be impacted. That's a huge number. That's several times the amount of habitat that has been created in Oregon for marble murrelets since they were listed under the State Endangered Species Act in 1975. So the potential implications of what we're talking about are absolutely mammoth. That number is extraordinary. And
That number is
getting
right,
down
though.
to
That number is not right. I'm sorry, I can't let you keep throwing that number out there. That you need to sit down with me and we'll go through that number.
Well, that's what I
That
wanted.
number, that number has gone through in the proposal, and that number, I'm sorry, Bob, we have to get on the same page on this one because
Yeah,
you keep throwing that number out there, and I just don't think that is our intent at all.
And I appreciate that, Katie, but that is the number that is in the HCP. That's
No.
the number that will be legally allowed. And we
So,
know
Bob-
that whether the intent is good or bad, that administrations change, priorities change. It could be kept by the state. It could be kept by OSU. We could have an administration at the state that is very aggressive around logging and doesn't care. That's the situation we had a decade ago when we sued the state to protect marble murrelets because they were actually logging in the trimas. So we know that it can happen. And we know that if an HCP goes through that allows it to happen, it may very well happen and we'll have no recourse. So we can talk about intentions a lot, but we have to talk about what actual tangible protections are really in place. And that's what I'm trying to get at here. And, again, I know I'm belaboring the point a little bit, but what we need to see through this FMP process is that watershed scale analysis that shows us up front that, in fact, these trimas are going to be better protected than they are today, not less protected. And that's really what I'm trying to get to here is we can talk all day about what's in the HCP and what the intentions are, but let's get down to the watershed level and actually really see so we can take that out and show people, yeah, in fact, these trimas are going to be better protected under this plan than they were under prior conditions.
So let me jump in here and sort of try to help a little bit in terms of the conversation. I think Tom and Katie, if you could either by way of timelines, when, or in terms of sequencing in the process, what is the right, so when does that watershed level analysis or conversation potentially happen? I mean, is that something that can happen sooner rather than later? Is it something that needs
It's
to
the
wait?
landscape analysis. It's part of the landscape analysis, just as I just pointed out. And it takes good data, it takes good model simulations, it takes us ability to understand it. And then that's part of that right there. That's where it occurs.
Okay.
And there was, again, it's also that's written in the forest management, in the research plan too, that analysis has to happen as part of the optimization process. I don't remember which page or which chapter, but it's in there. And it's been in there from the beginning. I've presented that same concept to this group several times. That, we took a first cut at using age, but age is a good surrogate for some things, but it's not the only part of the sample. And it's a huge surprise to us when we overlay some of these trimas or things like that and find out that they overlay a lot of clear cuts and some 17-year-old stands. And so then we want to look closer at that. Why are those young stands included in these areas? And how does that inform our decision going forward? And that's the process we underwent as part of our proposal development. And that's the process we'll continue to undergo. And I don't know if Jeff wants to speak about the HCP, but I just I want to make sure that it's clear that we that we don't have intention of degrading habitat, and we do have an intention of better understanding the species and better informing decisions as we go forward. So,
and we've spent hours on the phone and doing revisions to try to take what was a first cut translation of the proposal into HCP language and address the issues that Bob is talking about. And there's another draft coming out And I think it will go a long ways toward identifying that it's really not, it's really not as catastrophic as Bob, you just said it is. I don't think it'll be there.
And I appreciate that, Jeff, but I also want to I mean, I think there's something kind of a little condescending about describing my portrayal of it as catastrophic. That's what was released. And again, at the risk of belaboring it, I think what that tells me is that, we're between a rock and a hard place, because if we're going to do this level of analysis, that's great. And maybe we can rebuild our confidence. But right now, what emerged in an official document released by the state of Oregon for review was something that was fairly catastrophic. That's what you all put out there and asked us to respond to. That's what I'm responding to now. And I am worried that the FMP and the HCP are on different timelines, such that we won't get that kind of reassurance in time to, deal with the fact that the state may get an HCP that allows them to do, fairly high level take. So, I'm just trying to sync these things up a little bit here. But, in terms of my response to it, I'm simply responding to what you put out there. And that's all I can do.
And we are trying and have been, we put it out before it was fully baked because we wanted to partner with you to make sure that it's right. And that's what we're trying to do.
Thanks.
Thanks for the feedback. And Ken, you were up on this or a different topic as well.
Thank you, Peter. I wanted to touch back on a couple things that Katie said, and one was not an eye opener to me, but it was really well worded, and that had to do with the kind of a larger landscape level look here in the Coast Range. And I believe the words Katie used were something along the line of a triad within a triad. When we look at the landscape of the adjoining forest lands around the Elliott, so I guess I've always been kind of a bigger picture, and I've tried to emphasize several times, particularly early in this process, that we look across those boundary lines at things like the National Forest to the north, of course, all the industrial lands in BLM mix to the east, kind of the same thing to the south, as we think about these. And the second piece that ties to that, having a long career in kind of the planning side of the National Forest, particularly on the Siuslaw, the place that we always fall down is in the monitoring. That's what the feds have constantly fallen down in. We've done on the Siuslaw so many different kinds of experiments and stand treatments that have largely been forgotten about. That could be kind of integrated, I think, into this larger monitoring plan in terms of reaching out to the adjacent landowners and talking about some ways to compare and model different things that have happened over time. I have no idea if the capacity exists within this group and within the framework of this process, but I'd really like to talk maybe some more with Katie about some thoughts and just bounce off of her a few of the things that I've seen from a technician point of view happen on the landscape that we might be able to continue to learn and compare across the boundaries. So that's kind of my bigger picture thing. And Katie, I really like that triad within a triad comment, because that's really what we have. I wish I'd have been able to articulate that a whole lot earlier than you just did for me. So thanks.
Welcome.
Thanks, Ken. Mark Stern.
Yeah, thanks. I guess like Ken, I guess going back to maybe just a couple comments on Katie and some of the stuff you presented, and I found it helpful to see the overview, and again, sort of tying some of what you said into the table of contents. And one of my comments there has really been, you did a nice job at the beginning sort of describing the context for which the forest management plan and the Elliott is in right now, in terms of abiding by ESA, State Forest Practices Act. There'll be legislation that comes out of this, assuming there's a transfer that goes ahead to OSU and that context, and as well as those aspects of those sort of defining parameters with you, if you will, that are the context that you described there very well. To me, that would also be a great place to put that in the introduction as background of sort of, here's the orientation of this forest. It would account for those things that you described there. And to me, that was one thing that at least wasn't called out specifically in the table of contents. It could well be there. I realize there's a governance section there, but to me, that governance section is not really a subset of the planning area. It's really a defining element of the sideboards, of the context for this endeavor here. So my comment, I guess, is appreciating that you outlined all that, but suggesting maybe it just needs to be clarified and elevated within the table of contents there.
Thanks, Mark. Good suggestion.
A second comment really has to do with the models. And this is where I made my comment or reflection that, I wasn't sure I was the one to be able to comment on models, because in the spreadsheet you shared, and I realized I'm jumping ahead, but it makes reference to models, but it's not really clear what models are there. And there's probably an infinite number of models you could pick to develop, but it's sort of, and I get that you're sort of trying to parameterize the system, but the question really in my mind started to go, well, are you talking about sediment transport? Are you talking about stream flow? Are you talking about water quality, temperature? Is it a growth and yield model for silviculture? Is it a carbon flux, below ground, above ground? Is it mostly abiotic, or is it some biotic with murrelet you made reference to, or movement of big game animals relative to the broader landscape in Dean Creek? So I think that's where I began to feel like, yeah, I see what the models are, but at least as outlined in the spreadsheet, it was still open-ended. And I realize you may say, well, we're in the process of deciding what models, but I guess the playing field seemed so wide, it was hard to know, other than what I've just said, that models are probably a good idea, but there's an awful lot of thought that could go into which models you'll be able to use, because presumably you can't model everything you'd like to model, but so to me, that's where it seemed like the advisory group, as sort of the public forum here, was not well equipped to necessarily provide all the input that might be helpful.
So that's a great question, Mark. And Katie, as you respond, I wonder if there isn't a related sort of process piece of that. As you noted, the landscape analysis is where you sort of are able to get into some of the more detailed questions that Bob and others have raised. Is it, assuming there are multiple models that are going to need to be run and parameterized, et cetera, then does all of the modeling have to happen before the landscape analysis has to happen, or are there pieces that can move forward sort of in advance of others? And is there a sequencing piece of the landscape analysis that can happen, or do we do all of them? Is it a very stepwise sort of process approach? So I think it'd be helpful to hear both response to Mark as well as sort of the process you all are envisioning.
Yeah, and Mark, I appreciate that. And I don't think we expected the advisory committee to come up and say, oh, use, Century or use, FVS, or use, Rhesus, or whatever the modeling platform is. I think that those, it's more like, I hope you have a good model that helps us understand the implications of our decision-making on carbon. And so that you might give input like that. And so then the expertise that we would engage, obviously we have somebody that's interested in carbon and carbon sequestration and the roles of that within a management and research context. And so then we would make sure that we were testing or doing some of the simulations we want to run and looking at the impacts on carbon. And then it would be soil carbon, ecosystem level carbon, just tree carbon. So then you can start to break things down. And it's like you pointed out, you could be just modeling yourself into, I don't know, into a whirlpool and never come out of it. And so part of that too is that pragmatic sense of having a plan, an idea that's pragmatic to say, yes, we have to know about the effects of this on carbon. We're going to use this model, Landis, or whatever model it is. And that output will go into our landscape analysis, but then our landscape analysis may crop up and say, hey, this was, this is showing some what we consider strange results or results that we don't quite understand. Let's try something else to back that up. And and also there's, for example, a big need of these landscape level carbon models to integrate the aquatic system better. And there's more and more findings now scientifically that a properly functioning aquatic system sequesters a lot of carbon that builds up in the pools behind logs and log jams and the logs themselves that get entrained into the system. So are those included in the modeling exercise? So how did the aquatic and the terrestrial system integrate at a landscape scale? That's really important as well. And so, and then there's all kinds of disturbance level models, that climate predictions that also can be brought in and fed into this process. So you're right, there's an infinite number of models, and it just becomes a very pragmatic decision. And often the decisions made by the experts in the field of which model is going to be able to be used under the time and the other data constraints that we may have. So I hope that answers your question. Did I get it, or?
Yeah, I think it helps. I think it sort of goes back to my reflection that I see how you could say, well, as an advisory committee person, I could say, well, I hope you take carbon into account in the models that you're working on. And so that then you'll take that and respond. But again, I'm not sure that I'm providing necessarily, my thoughts are what they are, but I'm not sure it's as much rigor as you might appreciate getting if it was asked of others who were part of this conversation.
Yep.
To help inform the dialogue, which is, in a sense, this is the one public forum for this development of these thoughts. And while on the one hand, I agree with your answer, I'm still struggling with the, I don't know what I don't know. So if I don't ask the right question, does that mean it doesn't happen? And I realize there's a lot of other people involved, but anyway, that's my struggle with where we're at the moment.
Yeah, but no, I agree. I don't think that, I don't think the input we get stops with just this committee, and that's the community that we engage across multiple levels of thinking, from legislators through the people that are writing and developing these models and using them. So
Yeah, if I could just add to that too, I think that at any stage, Mark, we can flesh this out more in that front, and we could break it down by basically structure, function, and composition, because there's modeling around the stand development, stand structure, in terms of the which relates to stand carbon, which relates to productivity, which relates to habitat, and so you break it down within that structure realm, and then with function, you're modeling things like carbon, hydrologic response, nutrient cycling and turnover, and then under composition, of course, whole species composition and how that's changing, and so different pieces would be fed in, different pieces would be modeled and with that, and could be modeled depending on input, as Katie's saying, but we could definitely flesh that out to a greater degree at this stage and make it perhaps more explicit. but without going, into great detail about which model is going to be selected for a given process until we're certain of that choice based on expert input.
Thanks. So Keith, you're up. Katie, I wondered, did you want to touch base sort of briefly on the sort of modeling, sequencing, and getting to landscape analysis, or the watershed level conversation we discussed earlier? I mean, do you have to have all the modeling done, or does it happen in a sort of stepwise fashion, or is there sort of an iterative process there?
I'd say it's iterative. I think that part of that, like when we start to go looking at these, optimizations, the way it's done, the kind of questions might come up that say, what type of thinning should we do? Then we could run into some simulation models that would then inform the potential outcomes if we thin to certain levels in certain places. And so I see it's very iterative. And informative, because we may ask, once we get up into that watershed level analysis, we probably will ask some questions that'll make us want to go back down into the modeling phase and say, we should try this and run that, and or if there is a model that will do this, do we know about it? Is there somebody we could ask to make those runs? And so that's part of the thinking. And I don't know. Also, part of the thinking is, we wanted to bring in some postdoctoral students who have been running models in various realms, so that we have some people that understand how these things run. And we've also done a little bit of this already in the research planning. I mean, in the research plan, where we've done some modeling on what we call sensitivity analysis using a model called Woodstock. That helps us understand the potential outcomes for different species if we make decisions like this. So that has also been a really informative process. So we've got some demonstrations of what we're talking about in the proposal process, but what we're talking about here is a little bit more of that same type of stuff, but on steroids, and it would be very integrative. So
thanks, Katie. Keith?
I don't know. I'm not sure it's I think we've gone by my point, and if it comes back up again, I'll raise my hand.
Okay. All right. Any other overall kind of overarching comments, questions? If not, Katie,
do we need a break?
Yeah, I wondered how much more you had on sort of table of contents. Do you want to go through your slides and then we'll take a break, or do you want to take a break and then proceed with your slides?
I think there's maybe 6 slides or so. And to be at this point, I didn't think this would take this long, so I I hesitate to wear a crystal ball at this point. But we've been going for what, about 90 minutes?
Yeah. Why don't we see? Oh, go ahead, Tom.
I was just going to say, Katie, because she's halfway, I mean, I think you should just finish this section and then take a break.
Yeah, that would be my suggestion, and even give people some time during the break to mull over what you've presented here. So carry forward.
Okay. Well, again, my goal here in this next stage, that was just to set the stage. And my goal now is to basically look at kind of what are some of the examples that we examined, and helping us think about some of the pieces that we still need to include. So just as an example, the Western Oregon State Forest Management Plan, which is underway, the Elliott State, the 2011 Elliott State Forest Management Plan, and the Olympic Experimental State Forest Land Plan, that are 3 that we kind of touched base with a bit to help us, at least at a first crack of where, but we really have to ask ourselves too, as we do this. I don't want you to think I took these off the shelf and I said, okay, here's the answer. It's more, we have to ask ourselves, what are the similarities to what we're trying to do and what are the differences? But at the same time, for some things, like roads or something like that, there might not be great differences. Other pieces, there could be huge differences. And so I have to say probably the biggest one that comes right out of the gate as you read any of these plans is they all come out and say, our objective is to provide revenue for. They may have a little different constituents or something that they're trying to provide revenue for, but they all come out with that objective. And I believe in the Elliott 2011 Elliott State Forest Management Plan, I believe their objective was to produce 40 or 50 million board feet a year. So again, we have to place that in the context too, that we have a very different objective because we're a research forest. And so that's a major difference. And, but at the same time, there are some similarities. So, and so the things that kind of came up amongst the group in terms of things that we didn't have more explicitly were the roads. How are we going to deal or address the situation around roads? Traditional ecological knowledge came up, and how is that going to help inform us in the forest management planning process? The integrated pest management and invasive species component, strategies for protecting priority habitats such as wetlands, seeps, springs, and talus, the native and traditional use and practices, and this kind of relates back to that incorporation of traditional ecological knowledge, and what is the level of involvement by of tribal involvement. And so then that gets down to, somebody else asked us a lot about some of the more pragmatic pieces, such as where is the organizational structure, staffing, and funding, and is it going to have its own chapter? So those are the things that I really wanted to kind of touch base a little bit today and flush out some of this input. And the way to do that is to kind of start with thinking about, for example, with roads. If I look at the forest management plans, if I look through these on the situation of roads, and I'm not going to read through each one of these, so I apologize. I hope you guys. But the main point here is there is not a lot of detail in these management plans about roads, and in the 2011 Elliott Forest Management Plan, for example, they're relying on two other plans. There was a watershed plan, and there's an existing road inventory that they're relying on. But as far as really, talking about the roads and the road system, again, with under the objective of managing forests for revenue, they basically are stating we need roads, but we need to be careful in where we place them and how we place them, and we need to take into account both laws in terms of DEQ and Forest Practices Act, as well as a need to protect habitat and species and sediments and things like that. So that's my question for you guys is, what is the right level of detail in your mind or your thinking? And I'm not telling you, you need to tell me, you need to have X feet or anything that's truly expertise, but are these showing us the right level of detail? And should we continue down this, I'm going to do a pun here, down this road, or should we be looking for something else? And do you guys have any suggestions or thoughts on that? So that's one of our questions here.
Anybody who raised the topic of roads as an important element to consider and include in the FMP have initial reaction? Mark, it looks like you came off mute.
Yeah, I appreciate seeing the three of these in front of us. I suppose as an initial reaction, and it's really initial, but it's sort of where my thinking goes, is a little more clarity or definition on, do we have a general philosophy that we're going to maintain all existing roads? Are we going to decommission any roads? Is there a different strategy within the conservation management watersheds versus the management research watersheds? Is there a goal to have you know, the same amount of permanent roads? How does roads, I know roads and responding to fire often comes up. So there's, you know, there's a variety of perspectives on the merits and how many roads you need when, where, and how. So I guess those are some of my thoughts that come up of, are we able to script a goal and a direction at that level that we can define in the plan itself?
Mhm. Yeah, that's really helpful. And again, I think that also gets at this goal of the more integration. There's roads have shortfalls and they have benefits depending on your objectives. And so I think I think Ken might have some insight into that as well.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm not sure about a lot of insight there, Katie, but certainly a comment. You know, I'll have to apologize up front here for jumping into this process kind of at the last minute and just before it started. So I wasn't able to really look very well at some of the pre-work materials. So I guess the very general comment I would make about roads, and I'm sure everybody fully understands this, roads are a very serious ecological impact upon the landscape, and that runs from runs the gamut from sedimentation to disturbance of larger wildlife. So I would encourage us to think about having a fairly detailed roads analysis process somewhere embedded within this forest plan that does the simple things like identify what the need for a particular road is, what the impacts of a particular road is, how we mitigate some of the impacts if we decide we need to, we in the larger sense, not this group, but, looking at the public, looking at this in terms of, how we mitigate some impacts or how we get some multiple uses out of roads. And very specifically how we determine just how many roads we need on the landscape and whether we need those roads on a permanent basis, an intermittent basis, or we don't need them at all and can go into, as Mark said, some decommission activities. So in general, a roads analysis would be I think, a key element in looking at these roads rather than just look overall at what we've got and think generally about what we need. We should be very specific about determining what those needs are and maintenance levels, that sort of kind of too much detail when you get down into maintenance, et cetera, et cetera. So that was my comment. Roads analysis would be a real key in my humble opinion.
Thanks, Ken. Any other reactions to this? And I think helpful by way of example also. So roads as an example of the type of feedback as well as the type of information you'd want to see in that level of specificity. Okay, go ahead, Katie.
Again, if we look at traditional ecological knowledge, this one and how it's incorporated into a forest management process is something that is new. It's not something that in is been brought to the forefront, and I think it's a good thing to bring to the forefront, and I really appreciate the input we've been getting. But I think how we do that and how we engage the tribal, the tribes in all this, and how we engage other people is something that will be new, and I think but a key important component. So I guess for this one, it's kind of a stay tuned that we're working on that, and appreciate to have it still on our table, because, and if you have some input on the best way to do that, I would appreciate that as well. So. The other one is the integrated pest management invasive species. How that's going to be addressed and looking at the other plans, that it's becomes something that we have a section on disturbance in our and in the kind of the table of contents currently, and I think it could fit really well under that. And so, but exactly how and what we're going to do if we come across an invasive species, does it mean automatically pulling out, if it's a plant species, automatically pulling out the herbicides? Whether or not you're a believer in barred owls being an invasive species or being just a migrating species, or how that is seen within a system, is another one that I think would take quite a bit of wrestling with within a research context. But so this, I think, again, I appreciate whoever brought this one up. I think it was a good one to bring up, and it's also one that I'm curious with you guys where you think it might belong in terms of the and the relative importance of it as we go into the future. Does anybody have any thoughts or more, can allude a little bit more of what they were thinking about?
Okay, Katie, this is Mark. I didn't add that to the list, but I think it's one that maybe Steve or Bob or others did, but obviously it seems like it's worth including, just because it's a real problem that has to be addressed in any forest and any landscape that's going forward and has impacts going over time.
Mm-hmm.
I think, barred owls is an interesting one, obviously, that in some form or fashion needs to be at least acknowledged and addressed as a factor going on here. I also just wanted to comment for a second on the sort of traditional uses and indigenous considerations, and I think you kind of alluded to it, but obviously an example of where, at least at the moment, we don't have anyone from the tribes on the advisory committee or sort of best positioned to inform this conversation, and it's certainly one from the tribes in that audience that would probably be best suited to give you some more input and guidance on how that might be best addressed.
Yeah, I agree. And Randy may have some thoughts on this as well. He's done quite a bit of interaction through this process too. So.
And I apologize, Katie. I was tuned into the Merlet hearing, and I heard you ask the question of, are you asking about the species issue and who raised that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not who, but I just want to know if people wanted to flesh it out a little bit more. Again, because it's often seen in the context of mostly either deleterious effects such as plants like Scots broom, and then we need to add herbicides, or if you want to talk about it with maybe some invasive insect or disease, Phytophthora or something like that, and then what treatment we want to do. It's often seen in that context, but that's a little more narrow, and I know we're addressing some wider issues such as barred owls, for example. Are they considered an invasive species and a pest? And so it's blurrier than I think has been represented in these forest management plans. And so I think some input and elaboration on that would be great. And on what are some of the other contexts that could be thought of.
I definitely was one of the folks that raised that issue, and I think I think part of the question is how the plan does need to address invasive plant species. It does need to consider. I think when we get to wildlife, I guess I was looking at two things there really. I mean, one is just, and this isn't your question, but I want to raise it, is the need to think beyond the three species that we focused on and really consider other priority species and how they're going to be managed. I think particularly, for example, of imperiled salamanders and amphibians, and what kinds of precautions we're going to take for those species in the managed areas, but lots of other species as well. The former management plan focused on a much broader array of species, so I think we need to get to that. And then I think thinking about management of species like the barred owl is going to be important as well. And that's a piece that really hasn't been fleshed out. And so I'm not sure what else to add there.
So if you were, so the integrated pest management invasive species will be, could be addressed under, again, typically it's under kind of a healthy forest context and healthy forest ecosystems. But I think we're learning more and more about invasive species within other contexts, such as conservation, for example, and the ability to replace other species that are more desirable. So I guess it's where some of these topics would best fit in the current table of contents, or if it's a new chapter. I guess that's part of the thinking. And I think your input on other species is a really important one, other than just the species of concern. And I think that's a big part of the landscape analysis piece, because that's when you would be able to say, if this is what your landscape looks, how does it meet the goals or objectives for, I'm not a bird person, but for a warbler, or something like that. So that also falls into play of a little bit of example of how we did that in the research proposal too, under what we call our sensitivity analysis section, because that's really what it was looking at. So, but agree, it's important.
Yeah, and then just add a few more things in there. I think management of corvids, and that's gonna be a huge issue for murrelets. I think to flag that. So I think it is a chapter. I mean, I think it fits under other chapters, but I think there's a whole chapter about other species, and I just don't want us to get. I think about beaver and what does beaver management look like on the Elliott. I just don't want us to get mired down specifically in murrelets, coho, and spotted owls, and to make sure that we are thinking broadly about the landscape and the species that it serves. And of course, I know there's interest around the table about game species as well, and how those would be managed on the forest. So I think all of those things have to be part of a management plan.
All right. And it's interesting too, because if I look back and reading some of the history of the forest, at one time, because not the American beaver, the aquatic beaver, but the mountain beaver, the I don't know, the upland rodent that is common on the forest, there was a real desire of the foresters to stop trapping of the predators of the mountain beaver so that they would exert more natural control over the mountain beaver. But the state law superseded, and because that was under Fish and Wildlife, and that was a law that you had to allow trapping of bobcats and such. And so that was an interesting kind of study in the wanting to do something, but there was already a legal framework that was underway that they couldn't do it. So they put up signs just asking trappers not to trap. That was their solution. So, but it was just a side. Okay, but it also illustrates how complex these issues often are. So it may need its own chapter. So thanks, Bob. And so this one also came up as, in terms of strategies for protecting priority habitat and what they would do. And many of them, again, refer back to, or the Olympic at least refers back to their HCP. And then others have kind of direct things, such as looking at the overall, making sure it's in the overall goals and objectives that those strategies for protection are there, and then break it down into riparian and aquatic and debris flow, such as that under specific thing. That's what's in the current Western Oregon Forest Management Plan. And the Elliott 2011 didn't have a whole lot in there except the kind of the maintenance of some of these unique ecosystems. And so again, is this to me doesn't seem like it's the right level of detail of what we need. And this is, I think, where we go back to that we have some broader objectives and how they're reflected in that. And so this was a good example of one that didn't. Although I would say that if we looked at, I have another slide on the Western Oregon Forest Management Plan, which is the most recent one. They did have some more details on the landslide, debris flows, and steep slope strategies. That would be, I think, serve some guidance as well, that we can kind of take a look at based on the way their lands and landscape was being managed versus the way the Elliott is being proposed to be managed. How many of these and which way should they come over? And is this the right level of detail at this stage as well? So any inputs or thoughts on that?
Well, Katie, I guess, go ahead, Mark.
Well, I guess one thought is I like what I see here in the Western Oregon Forest Management Plan. It gets down to a little bit deeper level of specificity. But just even backing up from that, I think it's an important section, but it obviously just struck me probably needs some thought into the definition of what are the priority habitats or sites that need to be considered there. And so somewhere we'd want to try and define that at least initially and then figure out how to address it. But if I think I understood where you were going, I think, Katie, you were suggesting there needed to be some more detail to this section than the 3 other examples here that we're looking at.
Yeah, I thought the Western Oregon was on the right track in terms of the level of detail, but the other 2 were rather scant. And and some of it is, evaluate and minimize risks, for example. And so what does that mean? What is that level of analysis, and what does it mean to minimize risks? And so do you do that everywhere, every place, or do you do that with systems that you minimize the risk by incorporating more reserves into those systems? Or and we've done a lot of work to look at debris flow prone streams and the likelihood of them delivering wood at a large scale, which I talked about earlier. So
Thanks, Mark. Bob, did you want to chime in as well on this, or did Mark cover it?
I guess I would just say that, one of the things I worry about with this plan is that it's a fairly fixed, static landscape that you're trying to establish. And so I do think teasing it out at the watershed level of, really looking at what the priority habitats are within that watershed, how this plan lays out over them, whether they're a priority species and so on, is going to be important. And then also just the overall landscape integrity. Are we building a landscape really that has more connectivity, continuity, interior habitat, and so on? So I guess those are the kinds of things that I'm trying to get at with this issue as well.
Yep. So this one is kind of similar to the TEK one, but it's this concept of that was brought up about, again, the native and traditional use practices, as well as the continued tribal involvement. I think we've touched pretty well on it earlier when we talked about TEK, but I also think that it's something that the other forest management plans have touched upon, but I don't think fully flushed out as well. And so I would think that I hope we'd have a much higher bar. And that's partly spoken by this committee. And you're right, Mark, that we recently lost the more of the tribal related input on this committee, but I think it really brings home your point you've been making that we need to restore it. So. And again, not at the end, but at the beginning of the process. I think that's the other part, is that it shouldn't be, oh, and by the way, we need to check this one off, but instead that we make sure it's integrated from the beginning.
And I think folks are probably thinking this, Katie, but and tracking it, but Steve, having been a member of the working group and a staff member at the Klutzi tribe, also touching base with each of the other 3 tribes that are engaged in the 2 additional tribes that are engaged in the advisory committee process, as well as others who are the Western Oregon tribes that have been engaged through consultation or at least interest in the Elliott ongoing conversations. So that'll be important as well. And I know that's something you all are thinking of already.
So the last one was kind of, where's the, I don't know, the nuts and bolts, the organizational structure, the staffing, funding, all these pieces that are pretty critical. And there's some guidance in these to help us with this piece as well. But I think that, again, we got a research force, so we have a little bit different probably structure and than a typical, because we hope to have research scientists that are as embedded in this forest as they can be, and also many of the technicians, the people that would be hired, will be very much a different suite of expertise that may be part of this plan, as or part of this plan. So it's something we've thought about. It's something we've incorporated at least into our initial financial planning as well, but we're refining this all the time as we go forward. But so, again, understanding a little bit more about what that is on a research forest is something that we really hope to improve. But I do think it's going to need its own chapter, because it's going to really have to explain and kind of envision what that will look like. So, and I think we're kind of along the way, but I think we're going to learn a lot during the FMP that will inform us better about what people really need to be with boots on the ground and thinking about these things. And if I'm not right, that's the end, yay. So any comments on the organizational structure, staffing, and funding? I wore you all down. Wasn't my goal.
Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I think it's all in there. Those are broad categories, but it seems embedded in there is just sort of the financial plan of what's the projected revenue, what are the projected costs, and does it all sync up and align? And it's sort of implied in there, but I guess just sort of maybe stating what we're all thinking, that's sort of what everybody's going to want to need to know and see that it works to achieve all the outcomes that we're sort of seeking here.
Yep. Yeah, and that we have a business plan that's viable and realistic. I think that's okay. So I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. And that was going to be about a 10-minute presentation, by the way. I'm so sorry. But I'm really appreciative of the engagement. So
exactly, it was more than a presentation. It was a discussion. It was helpful, meaningful. Why don't we take 5 minutes, and when we come back, we'll have an opportunity for broad thoughts, reflections based on what you've heard. I think any additional topics that weren't raised by advisory committee and working group members that you didn't submit and we want to talk about, or questions from OSU, things that were suggested and determined not to be included, helping to understand why, etc., and or questions you had of the feedback. Then we'll talk next steps, if we have time, data, and finally we'll have some time at the end for public comment. So 5 minutes from your clock of reference, and we'll see you back.
okay.
If folks are back, want to come back on video, we'll know that you're ready to get started. Looks like folks are trickling in. Once Katie and Tom and others are back, we'll go ahead and get started. There's Katie, and there's Tom. Why don't we go ahead and get started? I guess my thinking is we do maybe the following. We can take any initial sort of overarching reactions and or topics that weren't covered that you'd like to mention from working group members. Any questions, comments that OSU has for the working group members. And then Katie, did you have specific like PowerPoints or slides or anything related to the timeline that you wanted to cover with the group before we go on to next steps towards the end? Sorry, you're on mute.
Okay, no, I don't have any more presentations. We could put the timeline up, but it's kind of such a monster. I don't know if it would be very useful to do in this format. So just, and I also wanted to point out that of all the input we got on the table of contents, everything else we incorporated into the table of contents. It was pretty obvious where it belonged, and it was, you know, that we just made sure it was a little maybe more explicit, that we knew that we were thinking of it and where it would be. And it's the only ones I brought kind of back up was because I wasn't sure exactly what level of detail and where to put it. So
great, that's helpful, Katie. Appreciate it. Any comments from the working group members? Anything that we didn't touch on that you expected to hear about, or yeah, thanks, Ryan Singleton.
Yeah, hey, Katie, you did a great job of outlining the structure of the plan. Remind me if an implementation or operational plan will be integrated into the FMP, or will that be a separate plan?
right now it'll be, I think, a separate plan. That's the way it was kind of outlined in the first slide of the process that I showed. But knowing, I think knowing as we go through things, it may actually be blended a little bit more, because as we really start to look at areas of the forest we might want to initiate experimentations on first or things like that, it may become a little bit more operational than initially intended. But
Okay,
I think the full operational plan would be something that would really be important for the actual forest manager and the staff that's kind of in place to really start to implement more than the planning phase that we're in now.
okay, that's helpful.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Katie. Ken and then Jeff.
I just want to make a quick mention, and again, apologies for jumping into this process late and not being able to comment on the table of contents. I did look through. I did notice a category for priority habitats, and there were, a short list there with an et cetera at the end. And, from my constituents' point of view, I'd really like to make sure that we continue to have a robust discussion within this plan that looks to the complex early cereal habitats. There's, we all know there's a tremendous lack of those particular habitats in the Coast Range because it being totally dominated by our friend Douglas fir. Want to make sure that we continue to have that discussion, and how that discussion relates specifically, to the species here that we're talking about, which are the large ungulates primarily, and then there's a whole suite, obviously, of other species that that follow in there, the neotropical birds, a whole bunch of large and small critters that I know very little about, but I know there's quite a list of species that are really looking for some of that early cereal habitat across the landscape, and how that is treated over space and time, and also related to disturbances like roads. So that was what I had to throw in. Thank you.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that comment too. And, when we were looking at some of the existing stand data that we do have, and thinking about how that plays in with, if we make a statement, for example, like, in this situation, we're going to have 80% retention in an extensive treatment. And people say, well, 80% of what? And we looked at the current distribution of the wild stands, the stands that initiated post-fire primarily, and their densities today is highly variable, down from really low density open grown stands to very high density stands that again are heavily dominated by the overstory and your friend Douglas fir. But that diversity is a really important thing to keep. And so rather than just say we're going to aim for a single stand density, instead, if we say we're going to aim for keeping that range of existing densities, and because we think representing that suite of habitats and types of, because the way the trees look are different, the way the ground vegetation is totally different. And that's one of the things that happens with plantation management, is you get a lot of homogenization. So what are the management strategies that we need to bring in to maintain that? And so I appreciate that input, because it's an important part of our thinking as well.
Great, Katie. I appreciate that response. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Jeff, and then Mark.
Yeah, and Katie, I've seen that graph that Katie was just referring to, and it's a really enlightening thing to see the diversity of that. I can second that. Katie, I might have missed this, but could you speak for a couple of minutes on how the adaptive management concept and identifying where in the forest you will go to first plays into the forest management planning process, or doesn't?
Yeah, that's a good question, Jeff, as well. That the whole concept of adaptive management kind of came about from that initial discussion about, this is a really big apple, and do we want to bite it all at once because we know everything about this apple, or do we want to, first look around and see where the wormholes are and avoid those areas and things like that. So that gave us this question, and we wrote a little piece about it in the research proposal as well, to say, being humble and recognizing that from where we sit now, we're not omnipotent and don't know everything. We should be maybe looking at putting in this grand experiment, larger scale experiment, in a stepwise fashion. So start with a subsample of the watershed, start the implementation there, and see what things we run up against. And also, as part of entering that process too, is what are some of the key criteria that we'd want to be monitoring carefully and closely to see if we're actually getting the right response, or not the right responses, but actually getting again to where we want to be and where we think we're actually going. And instead, of just saying, yeah, we're just going to start this, and in 60 years, we're going to find out if we actually got there. Instead, started on a little bit more concentrated basis of, a select number of watersheds, and see if we think we're actually going to get there. And so how those watersheds are chosen becomes part of this adaptive management process. What are the criteria for choosing them? We were talking about this before, and one of the things we threw out there was, well, maybe we should choose the ones that are already really close to being to already fitting their relative proportions of intensive, extensive, and reserve. So some watersheds are almost exactly where we want them to be in 60 years, but they're there now. They already have a good portion of older forests, and they have younger forests at the right, and so that's one way to think about it. The other one is, where are some areas that we don't want to go into for reasons of being sensitive to? So we don't want to go in there until we understand the system better. And so that we've tried a few things and done some experimentation. So whether they're important habitat for fish or whatever it is that becomes, some of those criteria. So that's part of it, is kind of bringing things out in a stepwise fashion, learning from that, and then, thinking about adjusting things over the longer term.
Maybe this relates to Brian's question. Katie, is that a part of the FMP or the operational plan, or like, I'm just trying to get my hands on is that just is it part of this process, or is that a more general question that Jeff just asked? I don't know.
Well, I can answer that it would be part of the FMP to maybe identify the criteria. Somebody's got to be muting. Talking to somebody, to identify the criteria, as well as to identify the areas we would maybe be most focused on, and in the beginning. So I think that would be a good part of the FMP.
Okay.
Most likely. If I can put on my crystal ball, I'll get it out. So, yeah.
Thanks, Katie. That got to what I was wondering about. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Mark?
Yeah, I feel like I've chimed in a fair bit along the way here, so I think that you have a sense of some of my thoughts, but it just sort of strikes me again of, you got some good input from Ken, and Ken, I'm glad you were here today, because I think you brought some good insight relative to big game and disturbance and roads and those sorts of issues to bring into the conversation, and Bob had some points as well. But also just concerned about the questions we didn't know enough to ask. And, it's unfortunate that Paul wasn't able to join today, since obviously he brings a voice and a perspective that would be important to hear from as well. And it just gets back to my original point of, I'm just not sure we have all the voices in the room or the depth of expertise we need, so that you feel like you really get public input through the advisory committee for all the things that might be important to consider. So I appreciate everything that we talked about and raised today, but I guess I'm And, you know, as I looked at the spreadsheet, and you're right, Katie, it's sort of a monstrous spreadsheet. And by necessity, it's somewhat brief in the description within each box, but at the same time, I have a sense that you have a clear or a deeper understanding of what the comments in each of the boxes of the spreadsheet are intended to address over time, but it's a little hard from the outside looking in to know exactly what all of that means. And some of it's to be determined. And so we talked about monitoring a little bit. And I think in the September meeting, it's a continued discussion about what's going to be not monitored, I'm sorry, but what's going to be in the model and what's not going to be in the model. And again, there are categories that capture a really big range of information, data, and analysis in there. So it's a little hard to comment on what you don't know to some extent. So that's my struggle, I admit, but I think it's also my context for the advisory committee generally as well.
Mark, I think it's a helpful observation. It's a helpful thing to continue to remind us all of. And I think if you see expertise or you know, folks either individually or because of their content expertise that would be helpful to you all and to the OSU team, I think raising those suggestions would be welcomed. And you know, and again, continue to raise it because I think it's important as a reminder that we not get in any of these situations. It's easy to get into a bit of an echo chamber where you feel like you've heard every voice, but you don't know what voices you're not hearing from that aren't a part of the conversation. So thanks for bringing it up. Any other comments? Ryan, you had one maybe here?
Yeah, just real quick. You know, usually FMPs are generally like 10-year plans, and understanding that OSU doesn't necessarily have their feet on the ground yet with understanding this forest. Katie, do you anticipate this being a 10-year plan with an option, and as we're talking about adaptive management, to have like a mid-course revision of some sort, like, hey, 5 years in, we can kind of revisit this and see where we're at, and then do the appropriate adaptive revisions to you know, address what we know, you know, once we've had a chance to understand the forest a little bit better.
Yeah, that's a question that I had, I guess, again, as a researcher, when you want to design an experiment, you kind of put a length of time associated with your experiment. And one of the things we've discovered, at least dealing with forests, is that 3-year time windows, which is the most common because that's typically funding cycles, not because that's what everyone wants to do, are the most typical. In almost every case I can think of that where we've done longer research, the decision we would have made at the end of 3 years is very different than the decision we would make at the end of 6 years or the end of 9 years or even. So I guess that question is really going to depend on what people are talking about. So you're right, there might be some parts of the forest management plan that would have a longer life and a longer intended life. And there may be parts of it that are going to be more adaptive and updatable. And so, because there's some things that are going to go on that we want to know what's the impact 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road. And there's other parts of it that you might, you know, learn something in 3 years that may want you to change some parts, but there are things too that need to be held steady. And I can see things like that being the conservation research watersheds. For example, if we embark on the thinning experiment we want to do, where we set up this variety of habitat types or habitats based on, you know, starting with these initial Doug fir plantations, we need to watch those over time to see how does it respond to certain wind events, how does it respond to certain droughts. do we achieve the species diversity we hope for? How does it respond to climate change? We can't answer those questions without waiting for a really long time. And if at the end of 3 years, we think, oh, wow, we've got to go in and reset that whole experiment, then we don't get to see those responses over time. So that's what I mean. There's some places I think that things would be relatively fixed, and there's other places that we may, like we want to reduce the road network, for example, and we put an experiment around that, and we found, wow, we found a really good way to do that, and it's really working well. Should we continue on that road or not? So that might be a different decision space. So that's a little different than I think a typical FMP, but it's more of a research related goal and objective. So
Yeah, thanks, Katie, appreciate it.
If I could just piggyback on that, Katie, a little bit, I thought that was a really good explanation or description of what we're envisioning. I think that in addition to the research end of it, there's just commitments that have been made in this process from that were spelled out in the research plan, that we want to transcend that 10-year window. So perhaps have a 10-year planning window. That's when that forest management plan is reconsidered and revisited. But there's elements to it that are described right up front that will be consistent or that won't be mutable unless there's some unusual circumstance that change that, whether it's a massive fire that covered the whole forest or whatever the case might be. But as Katie indicated, I think having it laid out in the forest management plan in this iteration, that there's parts that are long-term and parts that will be revisited in a 10-year window, and parts that are adaptive from a research management practice perspective would be really important.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Katie. Ken?
I'm going to take a deep breath before I try to frame this one. There are a huge array here of levels of expertise and past experiences in both in forest planning and in forest management, and then in a more general in the public sense, just an interest in our forest statewide, and in particular the public forest, how we define public for a given discussion. But what I'm kind of wondering is, and this kind of is more or less a direct question for Katie and maybe DSL both. Is there a way, or can we think through a process of a way to create for the layperson, and I'll put myself in the layperson category when I compare myself with levels of expertise like I see within Katie and Jeff and a few others here. Is there a way that we could create some kind of a what's in here or a how-to guide for the layperson to zero right in on their particular specific subject, whether that be something to do with outputs, in the sense of a timber, something to do with specific research designs and specific objectives. For my group, how do I get down to where I can find some early sorrel in a space where the elk aren't getting, harassed by daily traffic to the extent that they won't even be able to use some of the forage. Just a general layperson guide to how to sort our way through this. Again, I've got a 40-year career in federal management that had a lot to do with the NEPA planning process and creating these voluminous documents that people that really want to read them, really want to know where their particular interest point is located within that document. After a couple, 3 pages, their eyes glaze over and they put the thing back down. And, when back in the day when we used to be able to ask for paper copies, when the paper copies of an individual forest plan landed on my front porch, they weighed 5 or 6 pounds or more, and really, really difficult to sort through. So I guess really don't know how else to frame that, but is is there an opportunity here for a conversation about how we do a short, how do I find my interest point within this monstrous document? And it gets, in my mind, what we're doing here, by developing kind of the triad approach and looking toward a research forest, we all know this is something that hasn't been done at this scale nationally or internationally before. And it really, I can really see some confusion on the part of the average public person out there saying, what in the world are we trying to do with this research? And how do I look into this section and pick out my particular interest and into another section and find out how that affects my interest? What kinds of things, went into a thought process to lay out the thing that Katie might understand in terms of a research point of view, and Ken might not understand in terms of a gray bearded gentleman that's been hanging around Oregon watching forestry for all of his life. So that's kind of my bigger question there. And I'll be quiet.
I have a background in extension, but there's even somebody better here. And I'm gonna put her on the spot. And that's Holly. She's sitting there quietly, but Holly is really our brand new extension and outreach person. And so, and I think one of the reasons she's here is because that part of this process is really important to all of us. And so I'm going to give Holly the ground a little bit to help answer that question, assuming you got it all, Holly. And
thanks for
sorry to put you on the hot seat.
I might need to ask you to repeat a little bit of the question. So you're asking about making the management plan more digestible to people who don't have the technical expertise?
Well said. Yeah. That
okay.
Sums it up, Holly. Thanks.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's really what extension is all about. And so that is certainly something that we can make happen. OSU is all about the tripartite mission. There's the research, there's the teaching, and there's the extension. And extension is getting the research into the hands of the people who will use it. And it's also about translating science so that people who don't have technical backgrounds understand why we do what we do, why we make the decisions that we do. So I would certainly see it possible and recommend that we create a number of documents that differ in lengths and that are tailored to different audiences that help explain what's going on.
Thanks for the question.
More or less the perfect answer there, Holly. I might put you on speed dial.
You can do that.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Holly. Any other comments from the group on the table of contents? And then Katie, anything you wanted to cover related to the timeline and or comments from the group related to the timeline and spreadsheet, really?
I think it was more just to hear input at this point, so.
Working group members, any thoughts or reactions that you had based on sort of your initial read of that document? Okay. Katie, if I could, while you're still off mute, and I can put you now on the hot seat.
Thanks.
August 6th is the next scheduled meeting of this working group. So the morning of August 6th, when you think about that meeting, and it does relate a little bit to the timeline and spreadsheet, what do you anticipate the topics that will be covered, at least at this point, sort of generally, and then talk a little bit about what you see as your next steps, and then anything you need this group to be weighing in on?
Because I don't have the timeline in front of me, but I know Anna does. I'm gonna put Anna on the on
Hot
the hot
potato
seat.
here.
We're good at passing hot seats around, so too bad it's a sweltering post-tropical storm day here on the East Coast, but um, it is kind of hot seats around here. But anyways, Anna, do you have that document in front and can look at what's the topics of discussion and
Yeah, absolutely. So what we have written down, kind of penciled in, is a big focus on data in August, and starting to look at the database and data repository, and kind of gather feedback about, the structure of that. How's that going to look like? I think the hope was that we have a data scientist on board to help inform a lot of that conversation and start to think about the organization there and what data sets to include, and really kind of solidifying our plan moving forward in that front.
And I could see some of the kind of working, I don't know, topics would probably be to take, much like we did look at some other FMPs, to go look at some sites that have a very interactive database that we could show for people to go explore and to kind of look at what kind of data is available at research sites and research forests. So that would probably be a place we would start in that regard. So it's more informational and help people understand kind of where we envision we're going, because we can't show them anything right now, but we can show them examples of where we think we're going.
Yeah, and to elaborate on that just a little bit more is that we had talked about the H.J. Andrews has a really good example for what we're hoping to replicate here. So I think that would be something that we would look at, among others.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Katie. Mark, did you have a comment or question?
Maybe just a question if it's timely for insight, but I think on the spreadsheet for the advisory committee meeting on the 19th, it has one of the items for discussion is discussion on contract work inventories, wildlife surveys, and then at the next FMP meeting here, subgroup meeting in August, a refined discussion on contract work. I just wonder if you can give us any insight or update on sort of what that body of work is beginning to look like.
I can't at this point, so.
I mean, we do have the LiDAR
Oh, you're right, yep.
contract underway. You might talk about that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, Jeff was on the ball there, and the state has a special LiDAR contract, and we were able to get and Ryan as well, because of their work, we were able to kind of get the LiDAR acquisition off the ground. And so we could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, we're expecting to have initial data from complete overflights of the forest at a very high resolution. That Katie knows more about the ins and outs than I ever will. But we're expecting to have that in September available, and then proofed and correlated by later in the fall, and directly to support the FMP process.
And it's really exciting because the LiDAR we're working from now is 2008 at relatively low point density. And yeah, we're hoping to hit point densities that we can do a lot more understanding of canopy depths and all kinds of great measurements of structure. And so, yeah, we're really excited about that LiDAR. So we could talk about that a bit. Get Bogdan here. Everyone will be excited if we can get Bogdan in the room. They won't have a choice. So.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful.
Sorry, I just drew a blank. I was like, I don't know what to say. So that's just talking for too long.
Thanks. And Katie, do you want to say generally as it relates to the FMP, what you would anticipate covering during the meeting on the 19th for the full advisory committee?
I think it's mostly kind of just reiterating what we've covered here for the full committee, more in a summary type of a framework. And so kind of summarizing what the key components were of today's discussion, and inviting some more input if they have something that we've all missed. So that's kind of getting at Mark's comment that this is a small slice. And so it's kind of going back there to look at a broader group to see what things we may have missed in this discussion.
And likely sharing the draft table of contents and timeline associated with the work as well.
Mhm. We love to give everyone that timeline so they can all get out their magnifying glasses and try to follow it. But Gantt charts don't always work in some formats, but so.
And for the working group members, anything you would want to cover or address with the full advisory committee specifically as a working group? Mark?
Yeah, and I apologize, Ryan, you may have asked this question and it may have been answered before. I was pulled into something else for a second, but I guess just a general comment on for the advisory committee as a whole next week. It'd be great to get an update on where OSU might be at in the hiring process for the position that was advertised earlier, a couple months ago or so. Again, I apologize if you guys covered that a few minutes ago. I just was pulled into something else for a second, but I think that'd be good for the whole committee to hear.
Thanks, Mark. Great. Anything else for the good of the order? If not, we've got time reserved here for public comment. I had Sue, Anne Marie, and Fergus each suggest that they had something they wanted to share. Before we start there, Sue, any other members of the public that wanted to weigh in or make any comments to the working group? You can give a reaction with the reaction button at the bottom of your screen with thumbs up, or come off mute and just say so and we'll call on you in order. Oh, okay. Sue, and maybe try to keep it to 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay, could I ask you to let Fergus go first? And then
Sure.
I can comment after that. Fergus, you need to unmute.
Okay, you're putting me on the hot seats. Now, Sue. Sue and I are on the Sierra Club State Forest Advisory Group for chapters policy on the Elliott. I've been following this from the beginning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to comment. Appreciate the enormous amount of work each one of you has put into this process. It's a daunting problem. I have to extend my sympathy to OSU for the job you were offered by Treasurer Reed, which was to deliver a plan for a research forest that funds itself, which has seemed to have disappeared off the horizon. So I guess we can say that so far this experiment has delivered the result that no, you cannot have a research forest that funds itself. I'd like to offer one general and a specific criticism of OSU's work. OSU apparently is in a perpetual draft mode and has a long way to go to produce the deliverables that Director Walker expects from you. Starting this process was very exciting to me as a career forester who have seen two epical developments in forestry, one being the revelations about the carbon generated by Northwest Forests, the other, the final publication of Jerry Franklin's first ecological forestry textbook, which will transform the teaching of silviculture in the United States and around the world. Unfortunately, this plan has not really addressed them in a constructive way. One of the questions was about experts. I have a couple recommendations. Tom, if you want to go across the courtyard
Dr. Sherry Johnson manages the Andrews Forest and manages finances for them for the National Science Foundation and has published on the creation of research forests. You might want to consult her. She's got some interesting perspectives. This committee did invite the testimony of Jerry Franklin. However, if not only, well, she has not only ignored Dr. Franklin's profound criticism of their plan, has actually distorted the principles of ecological forestry in this supposedly extensive thinning protocol, which is unprecedented, has never been tested, has no silvicultural value at all. It actually violates the fundamental principles of ecological forestry. And unfortunately, as Dr. Franklin points out, you've extended this across the forest, so we basically have an uncontrolled experiment in an unproven thinning method, which has no scientific validity.
And Fergus, you got maybe about 30 more seconds or so. I'll give you a full four plus minutes there.
Okay, thank you, Peter. My general criticism would be just relaying Dr. Franklin's criticism of OSU's research design, which is A, has no control, B, is not applicable, does not address the questions of forestry that are important to Oregonians. The specific one would be the way you've distorted ecological forestry, calling it extensive thinning, which is really, really unfortunate. It's so misdirected. And I would also go back to my initial input on this whole process, which is you should start with the carbon, because the carbon reserves are also murrelet reserves. You start with the carbon, then you're going to get the carbon and the murrelets. But of course, that would require going back and starting completely over. I wish you good luck on your process, and thanks again for the opportunity to comment.
Thanks, Fergus. Anne Marie, are you willing to let Sue go in front of you so they can stay knit together?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right, Sue, you are up.
Okay, thank you again for all the work you are all doing. I think my comments would be very simple in that this whole region of Oregon is vital to this world's forestry. And I hope we can keep that huge picture in mind, because worldwide, we have destroyed so many of our forests. And the fact that you have to take out so many board feet every year is pretty awful. And I really wish you could find another way to do a lot of this. I'm looking into hemp fiber as a way to produce paper, etc. All the other ways to produce things that are wood products. We need to look into that also. So we have to stop cutting our trees down, because obviously it's not a good thing for our world. So that would be my overall reaching comment, which probably is not within your function with this forest, but I hope you, Dr. DeLuca, I hope you will think in terms of this with your forestry department, of other ways to produce what we have depended on with our wood. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sue. Anne Marie?
Yes. Yes, can you hear me?
We sure can.
Okay. Just wanted to say also that my colleague Barry Sanders was trying to signal that he would like to speak. Anne Marie Oliver, Oregon Institute for Creative Research. The first thing I have to say is that once again, I'm shocked and appalled. No mention of context, no mention of what's happening in our world. We had 116 degrees weather here, quote unquote. Not a word about what's happening. Not a word about research that's already being carried out on the impact of roads and forests. Not a word about can Doug firs actually survive in this new world in which it's not clear what and who will survive. That's shocking, because you've talked about experts and intention and so forth and so on, but the general context is missing. We can no longer continue to talk in the manner that we're talking 20 to 30 years down the road. Really? I don't think so. The second matter has to do with the question of experts, since there's a general preoccupation today with experts and expertise. When we talk about experts, we talk about not only context, but knowledge, understanding, methodology, epistemology, approaches to the world. And the first thing that has to be talked about is what kind of world we're talking about again. So I've heard a lot today about, and I have many, many notes here, which I'm going to stop. The question of an expert also has to do not just with his or her so-called interest and training and experience, but it's a basic approach to the world. And there's only one word that will do here. It's called integrity. There are a number of experts here today. Mr. Fergus, I don't know what your name is, Ms. Craig, Mr. Salinger, Mr. Stern, who's an expert on everything from snowy plovers to yellow rails to neotropical birds. Mr. McCall, I appreciated what you had to say about roads. But you see, it's a matter of attitude, not management. It's a matter of on what it is you've devoted your life to. So we're talking about a forest, and I don't think we can continue to talk about forest in this kind of very arrogant managerial way. You can actually hear what people are saying because it's a matter of language and respect. Whether they're talking about improving process, you're doing what you're doing to improve process? A business plan, transformational changes in forestry. We're going to degrade a forest in order to find out transformation, to enable transformational changes in forestry, data production, interest, simulations, models, and so forth and so on. The production of data, but we're talking about a living forest, and there's no expert here or non-expert who actually knows what a forest is. That's the first step here. We are interested in the perpetuity of this planet, and we have to start speaking like that. I'm really sorry, with all due respect. I appreciate what everybody's doing. You have experts. You actually, I didn't hear any respect paid to those experts. It doesn't matter how many hours you've spent on this project. Rethink everything. We have to rethink everything. It seems very clear. There's a red alert. The United Nations has just put it out.
Just a couple of seconds there, Anne-Marie.
Time to rethink everything. Thank you. We urge you to please stop and rethink everything. The point of life is not the production of data. Thank you.
Thanks. And it sounded like, Barry, if you're able to come off mute, we've got a little bit more time here for you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yep. So I don't know what, this is a reverb. Okay. So my comment really is about something that Mr. Stern mentioned, and it's about expertise. And it really focuses on what's happening right now, this second. I'm given 3 minutes or 3.5 minutes to speak as a person from the public. I think I have expertise in the sense that I have common sense and I can think, and I am a resident of this state. I think there should be people from the public on this committee who have a different kind of expertise, who are living and enjoying and being in the state and in the forest. When I was a young man, there was an architect named Paolo Soleri. And in Arizona, he built something called Arco Santi. Maybe some of you remember it. But what he wanted to do was see if he could get a self-contained society, civilization, almost, if it could be that broad. And I feel like these discussions are like that, self-contained. As Anne Marie said, it was 116 last week. It's not a heat wave. We're facing global climate catastrophe. I haven't heard anybody, any single one of you mention it. How can we be cutting down one more single tree? How can we be doing that? And as Anne Marie again says, you guys are talking about 30 years out. We may not have 30 years. How can you be talking about all of this as if you were at Arco Santi, as if you were a self-contained unit? You're not talking about the fate of the forest, though you are. You're talking about the fate of the earth. You have a responsibility, a great one. And Mr. Stern, I would urge you to try to get some people, human beings, residents, citizens of Oregon on this committee, so there could be some discussion rather than I get 3 minutes and then it's forgotten. I've watched this, I've attended, I think, almost every meeting. Nothing I say ever gets folded into, or Anne Marie or any of the people I've seen folded into this discussion. Please take heed. We're in dire shape. It's going to be 130 degrees tomorrow in Death Valley. We're facing something horrible. We had a state of emergency leveled by Kate Brown, by the governor. You know what her solution is? Get more boots on the ground, get more firemen, get more fire people out there. We can't cut one more tree. It's almost, I want to say, criminal. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Barry. And with that, we will adjourn our meeting today and appreciate all of you attending. We will follow up in advance of the advisory committee meeting with meeting materials. So you can stay tuned for that, as well as we prep for the August working group, forest management plan working group conversation. As always, you know, I think if you have suggestions on folks that OSU should be speaking with, welcome those. I do think, in light of the focus of the August meeting being on data, content, etc., there was a request at the last meeting and time in between of, if you have data sets, information that the OSU team would benefit from knowing about or accessing, be helpful to tune them into those data and information. They have a lot, obviously, many of you have mentioned that, but if you're aware of information out there, watershed councils, you know, anything from that all the way up to sort of ODF's information from past management of the Elliott as well. So again, appreciate your time. We'll follow up with next steps after the meeting, as well as sort of the recording and meeting summary from today. Thanks again for all your time. Have a great day.